there are various interpretations, differentiations in terms of how folks frame equity. One of the things that more readily occurs is that people will conflate treating individuals the same, and considering if all things are equal, that somehow that produces equitable outcomes, right? And so when we think about today's college student, our campuses are very diverse in the way of cultural pluralism. And I think there's a way when we talk about equity within the larger conversation of assessment that this is very much nuanced, because we have to not only think about who our students are as learners and those intersecting selves relative to their backgrounds in terms of race and ethnicity, gender, nationality, income, sexuality, and so forth, that we have to keep that in mind, because as they come to us, that is also influencing the environment, and the extent to which we're responsive or not is also influencing them as learners. And so I think there's a way, particularly within the U.S., that there's a fairly westernized template. It's very contextualized and norm referenced on dominant culture, and dominant culture not necessarily being one that is culturally responsive across the spectrum of difference for varying and diverse learners. One of the things when we think about assessing student learning and when we think about college student development is that, again, whether it's the 2-year or the 4-year, that we have to be very cognizant of who our learners are, to find ways to affirm the learners in terms of their cultural knowledge, cultural capital that they bring to our campuses and in our classrooms, their experiential knowledge, find differential ways of getting at how they have achieved the different benchmarks for learning, and what we consider to be the requisite skill sets and knowledge base within a particular area. So say, for instance, credit for prior learning. That's one example of how, again, institutions are doing it, but not doing enough of kind of stepping outside of the box to really kind of consider where learning occurs, who are our learners, what are the different types of assessments that we could do to gauge whether or not learning has been transferred. That knowledge is definitely there in terms of the skill sets that are requisite for a particular area, whether it's moving from one course to the next in terms of prereqs, or whether it's they're transferring on to gainful employment or to further education. We educate all kids. We don't give all kids the same education. How can we create a more balanced scale, if you will, in the way of that dichotomy, right? Because it shouldn't be a binary of some kids have these really great experiences and resources and others don't. And similarly, when we think about life course theory, that follows students so that some of their opportunities as they move toward post-secondary or the workplace have been thwarted. But we have to figure out how to address that. I think within the paper, what resonated with me was the fact that, and I am in agreement with parts of the occasional paper that talk about the intentionality that is needed by higher ed, and whether it's 2-year or 4-year within that sector, that we have to be very vigilant in thinking about upfront when we talk about student learning outcomes. What students do we have in mind? Who are we norm referencing assessment practices on in terms of what we value in the way of learning, what types of learning, because learning can occur anywhere and everywhere, and how do we assign value to those different learning experiences, particularly when we have such divergent learners. What NALOLA is doing is quite necessary and welcomed, and not just when we think about college student learners, but when we think about learning throughout the pipeline, right? And so, I want to say it was 2015, fall 2015, where for the first time, students that were entering public schools in terms of kindergarten, there was a majority-minority for school-age students at that point. And so when we think about that, there's this increasing diversity of student learners entering our educational system, and that by and large, over 80% of teachers that they will encounter in public K-12 schools are white instructors, and again, the vast majority of white teachers are female white teachers. And so we have a disconnect in terms of the student learners that are coming into the educational system and those that are meeting them. And what we'd like to see is greater congruence, cultural congruence between those that are teaching our kids and the kids feeling connected with the teachers. And so part of having culturally responsive pedagogies, engaging in culturally relevant practices, producing culturally proficient educational leaders is very necessary, timely, and so I think that there are ways in which the work that is happening with Neola is going to be instructive, not just for K-12 or higher ed, but as we think about learning in general. I think that the responsibility is one that is shared, right? So institutional leaders have to bear some onus for saying, okay, if we are not doing well with a particular demographic, well, we're not going to have a blame the victim mentality. We're educators, right? It's our duty to educate and elevate. So to the extent that there is a pocket of students that may be struggling, what is it that we can do differently, right? And as far as stakeholders, it's not just that we have to have our administrators on board trying to figure out what we can do differently, but how they work in concert with those that are delivering the instruction to come up with creative solutions for, getting a stop to that gap in learning and trying to produce more equitable outcomes. The parents, in terms of those that are minors in the way of their education, the policy community. I think there's so many different voices that are necessary and stakeholders that have a vested interest in making sure that all students learn. Some of our assessment practices, frankly, are outdated. We still do within education, we still do a lot of what we've done for decades, if not centuries, in the way of how we assess students and their learning. But I think that one of the things that when we think about assessment practices, just as students have become increasingly diverse, so too should our means and ways of assigning value to who the students are, what the learning is, how to make it transferable. They too have to be diversified, and they have to evolve. They have to evolve because to the extent that they don't, we're actually going to have an impasse in the way of improvements for really gauging what students learn and how we maximize their learning.